Although David had been in part-time service for Saul for some time, playing music and serving as an armour-bearer, Saul hadn't really taken any notice of this young man. He was more concerned about other things, like the Philistines who were going to attack. And when the Philistines did attack, David went home to look after the sheep, while Saul went to war, and 3 of David's older brothers went to war as well. But the Philistines trotted out their champion, Goliath. And Goliath came before them every day, standing nearly 10 feet tall, and challenging, "Give me a man to fight. You kill me, we'll serve you. I kill you, you'll serve us." Of course, they had the cards stacked, because this man was much taller than any of the Israelites, even 2 foot taller than Saul himself. And this challenge went on for 6 weeks. David's father sent David with some bread and cheese to the soldiers, and when David heard Goliath boasting, he was affronted. This was not just a challenge of the armies of Israel, this was a challenge to God, and he took on Goliath himself, though he was just a lad, and defeated Goliath with a sling stone, and cut off his head with his own sword. Saul said, "Who is this young man?" And David is presented to Saul. And when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan, Saul's son, was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house any more. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him, and gave it to David, with his armour, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened as they were going home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced, and said, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Now Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" So Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, "I will pin David to the wall." But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence, and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." So David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Meholathite as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, "I'll give her to him, that she may be a snare to him." and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, You shall be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, Communicate with David secretly, and say, Look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David, and David said, Does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor and lightly esteemed man? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, In this manner David spoke. Then Saul said, Thus you shall say to David, The king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share these verses from 1 Samuel chapter 18. We see David very humble because he is a servant of God. He knows the greatness of God, and it was never his plan to become king, even though he has been anointed king by Samuel. And Saul knows that God has appointed someone else to be king. But David has captured the imagination of the people. He's only a young man, and after one battle where he killed Goliath, the people attribute to him 10,000s, and Saul thousands, whereas in fact Saul is the one who has had many battles under his belt, and no doubt has killed a good number of Philistines. But it is the Lord who fights the battles, and the Lord has withdrawn Saul. He has this distressing spirit. David has the Spirit of God because he walks humbly with his God, and he is biding God's time. We noted that Jonathan, Saul's son, was a young man with a clearer, a simpler faith in God than Saul himself had. Jonathan sees in David someone of his own spirit. He loved him as his own soul, and they make a covenant with each other. And at this point, Jonathan, who's the heir apparent to Saul's throne, gives David his robe, his armour, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, in giving these things, he is submitting himself to David, putting himself dependent on David in a symbolic way. David takes on responsibilities in the army. He behaves wisely, and so he always comes home with success under his belt. This really irritates Saul, who tries to kill David directly himself, but David escapes, and then by sending him out on missions. But David behaves wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. We need those two things together. There are men who have wisdom, but they do not have the Lord. There are men who have the Lord, but do not follow his advice. But David behaved wisely, and the Lord was with him. Saul had promised his daughter to whoever defeated Goliath. But when the day came, he gave Merab to somebody else. But Saul's second daughter, in love with David, and so he agrees to give her to David. Meanwhile, David is saying, I'm not worthy for such a position. But Saul sets him a task and he completes it. And so Michal becomes David's wife. And Saul sees that the Lord is helping David. He's behaving more wisely than all the other servants of Saul. And Saul fears David.